This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Você vale muito. Eu não sei quantas vezes alguém já te disse isso, mas eu precisava repetir porque você vale muito. Não importa quantas vezes alguém tente te convencer do contrário. Eu tô aqui para reconhecer o seu valor, porque eu também já precisei de muitas para reconhecer e reforçar o meu. E não há nada mais poderoso do que celebrar juntas, porque nós valemos muito. L'Oréal Paris, porque você vale muito.
Welcome to the Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and I am joined by a new guest today, and that is KJ Brown. How you doing today?
Hey, Perry, how's it going? I'm doing all right.
Doing pretty good myself. So what we like to do with new guests especially is talk a little bit about yourself. Tell people who you are, what you do, all that fun stuff.
Hey guys, so I'm KJ, out of the Philadelphia area, and I have a few shows myself that I guess I'll just bring up right here on the top of the episode. After you've listened to all the fantastic Japan on Film episodes, if you want to check out another show, Talking Pictures Trivia, we do movie trivia. We've done a few Japanese films like Memories of Matsuko. We've done Afterlife, which I know you've done, Perry. That was a great episode. Shin Godzilla, we have a bunch on there, so go check those out. We have a few other shows, Limited Lexicon. We have a new one coming out this summer called Keep Making Movies, where we're looking at micro-budget films. There'll be a few Japanese films there, Beyond the Infinite 2 Minutes, Summertime Machine Blues. Just enjoy podcasting. I usually do a lot of the editing and producing. I'm not always on the episodes, but that's me.
Very cool. For that, the low budget film episode, there's one we did on my other podcast, Superhero Cinephiles, called Freaks. I'm not sure if you've ever heard about that.
No.
Yeah, it's a really cool movie, and talking about micro budget, it had a really tiny budget. That's something you might want to take a look at it because it was really
absolutely
interesting.
Cool. Freaks. We'll check it out.
So how long have you been in the podcasting space?
So we started recording just before the pandemic, and the pandemic kept us going for better or worse. So I guess, what's that, 2020 now? So almost 4 years-ish we've been releasing.
Yeah, I had pretty much the same situation. I had started both these two shows like right before the pandemic started, and then my other show, which I was doing with a co-host at first, a regular co-host at first. We were doing it bi-weekly at first, and then during the pandemic, we're like, let's go to weekly. Why not? We got nothing else to do.
Yeah.
Very cool. And so obviously this is a Japanese movie podcast, as you know, and you mentioned some of the stuff we've talked about here, like Afterlife and Shin Godzilla. I have not checked out Memories of Matsuko yet, although that is one of the ones I've got on my list. How did you get interested in Japanese movies?
Well, I'll tell you, Perry, it actually was Memories of Matsuko. So I was living in Japan with my wife, Rachel, and Rachel's awesome. She's a really good traveler. I was about to say, anytime you get to travel, you should travel with Rachel, but that's a weird recommendation, audience. But she found a group in Osaka. So we were living in Osaka, and there was a group that welcomed foreigners. I don't know exactly how to describe this group, but she would hang out with them once a month or so. And one night they had a movie night. And the movie was Memories of Matsuko. So we were in this small room. There was like folding chairs. It wasn't a theater per se. You know, there's a projector probably hooked up to a DVD player at the time, I guess. And Memories of Matsuko comes on, and it changed what I thought films could be. I had never seen something like that before. And I realized, oh man, films that aren't just made in Hollywood can do other things than films made in Hollywood. And it really made me want to explore other international films. From there, I watched Departures, which had come out that year and was nominated, I think, for Best International Film. I forget what that category is called. Michael Hahn, Why Don't You Play in Hell? Kyo no Mon, Afterlife, like you talked about. So just these I really enjoyed these films. And that's kind of how I got on Japanese films and even international films in general.
Very cool. So I wasn't aware that you were living in Japan before. So you guys were living in Osaka, you said. What were you doing here? Were you teaching? Were you doing something else?
We were teaching English for well, should I say the name of the company for one of the big four at the time.
Okay.
It was
One of the Eikaiwa ones.
yes, Eikaiwa, that was the word. Yeah, which is really fun, audience. If you have a year of your life where you want to go live in Japan, it's not a bad way to do it. It was a lot of fun. You meet a lot of cool people, and you get to talk a little bit and you get to listen a lot. So yeah, we were living in Osaka, which was also cool. We got to teach in a lot of Kansai. Kansai is Osaka, Kyoto, Kobe.
Mhm.
But then every so often they might send us a little bit further out to teach too. It was kind of day to day.
So were you guys ALTs, or were you working in one of the conversation schools?
One of the conversation schools.
Okay.
What's an ALT?
So ALT is assistant language teacher. They're the ones that are sent into public schools like junior high, high school, elementary school, kindergarten as well sometimes, and preschool. And basically just you're well at the junior high and high school level, you are working with an English speaking Japanese teacher who like teaches the official English subject. In elementary schools, you're technically there to assist the homeroom teacher, but at least in my experience and most people who I know, most of the homeroom teachers don't speak any English, so you're basically teaching the class yourself while the homeroom teacher just kind of like stands next to you.
Yeah, no, this was conversational. So as long as you could, string a sentence together, and honestly, the more colloquial you were, the more the schools wanted you because that's what they were
Mhm.
looking for. Most of the students could already speak some English, but when they traveled, they had trouble understanding it, so they wanted to hear it from a very native person. So.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I taught at one of those schools for about 6 months in Ehime, so was not bad. Like you said, you meet some really interesting people, had some really interesting conversations. My biggest problem with that job was just the hours were crazy because I had like it was like from like 1 o'clock in the afternoon until like 9 o'clock at night.
Hmm. Yeah, and I imagine, were you starting a family at that point, Barry, or was that?
No, this is before I met my wife, so I wouldn't have to worry about that. I mean, I do still teach night classes now, but like almost all of them are online. So and that is still only like, 3 days out of the week. And I've only got one night when I actually have to leave the house at night. Otherwise, I'm usually back home by like the latest is like by 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So
Oh,
once
that's
my kids
great.
start preschool, it'll definitely be a lot easier on my wife, especially because she's gonna be going back to work in April.
Great.
So you were talking about all the how Memories of Moscow kind of showed you like different things that movies can do outside of the Hollywood system, and I had kind of a similar reaction when I first saw like Audition and Gozu and all these kinds of like Gonzo Japanese movies. But the funny thing is, when I actually came to Japan, and one of the reasons I came was because I developed this interest in Japanese movies. And when I talked to Japanese people, and they'd ask me like, well, "Why'd you come?" And I said, "Oh, well, I like Japanese movies. Had the opportunity. I thought I'd come over here." They're like, "Oh, what Japanese movies do you like?" And I'd start rattling off like some of these bizarre titles, and they just kind of like look at me like, "What are you talking about? I've never heard of these movies before." And so that's when I realized that like, oh yeah, all the like weird, bizarre stuff that most people in America or in other countries get to experience and they kind of associate with Japanese movies. Those are movies that like kind of fly really under the radar in Japan itself. And like most of the stuff that you go see in the theater, it is very much like, dramas or romantic comedies, or lately there has been some attempts to kind of mimic like some more big budget type stuff in Hollywood.
That's hilarious.
But we are talking about one of these kind of bizarre Gonzo movies today, and that is 1977's House. Same title in English and Japanese, just written in katakana in Japanese. So the pronunciation Japanese is technically House, and it's called. Wikipedia calls it an experimental comedy horror film, and it was directed and produced and kind of and written a little bit by Nobuhiko Obayashi. And I think this was his first movie. I know. I don't know if it was the only thing he did. Um, but yeah, I've been hearing about this movie for years, like for like at least 15 years I've been hearing people talk about this movie, and it was one of my friends originally from Chicago who had first mentioned it to me, and then it had come up in conversation here and there, and people were like, "Oh, have you ever seen House? It's like the strangest movie you've ever seen," and it's just one of those things that I just never gotten around to seeing until recently. I'd finally able to find a copy of it here in Japan. I picked it up and I just kind of put it on the list, and I haven't actually had a chance to sit down and watch it until you came in and you chose to discuss it. So that was kind of my experience, was just kind of like hearing about it for so long, and then finally actually watching it like after everybody talking about it. So I'm a little bit late to the show on this. But what about you? What was your experience with this movie?
I think the first time I watched it was maybe 5 years ago or so, just on the hunt for more Japanese international films. And, it's on tons of lists, like you say, gotta watch it, gotta watch it. I
Hmm.
think it was on HBO at the time, whatever their streamer was called at that point. But then, second watch was for the podcast Talking Pictures Trivia, episode number
Hmm.
76. And then, I actually got to see this in theaters in
Oh,
Philly.
nice.
They have a really cool theater called the Philadelphia Film Society. So it was really fun to watch with the crowd. I'm not sure if the crowd knew what they were signed up for, but it was really great. And I watched it again with my daughter. That was a really fun watch. She really enjoyed that. And then this weekend for Japan on Film. So right before I hit play, I got really excited again to watch it. I really do enjoy House. I think it's a super fun movie, and I think if you know what you're walking into, it's a really good movie.
Hmm. So what was kind of some of your impressions of it, if you can remember back the first time you saw it?
You know, what's tricky about this movie is it takes a while to find the flow,
Hmm.
right? Because it moves really quickly, but not much happens. Well, I guess stuff happens, but the way the shots are set up is they're really quick. Sometimes it feels like it's stills that are happening in front of you, right? The flow of the actual shots is very bizarre, very rhythmic, very strange. Um, and the other thing that takes a while to get used to is the score, that
Hmm.
piano motif, which I learned to love, that dun 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 dun. And then it's backed up with almost like carnival music, which is
Hmm.
kind of a bizarre, uh,
Yeah.
you know, through line through the movie. Um, so it takes a little bit of time to get used to what you're about to watch. But I think after 20 minutes or so, as long as you let that in, you're in. Like then it's a well-paced movie for the rest of the film. How about you, Perry? What were your first impressions?
So my first impression was it was funny when when we opened this and we opened in the scene with them in the classroom and everything. My first impression was, wow, this is very expository dialogue. Like it's the like as far as like the actual dialogue goes and the characters, that it is very very surface level, and they do a lot of exposition. And you can tell that that is not what Obayashi is really interested in talking about. He is more interested to get them into these situations and to just start playing around with different things you can do on film.
Yeah, no, that is true. He absolutely wants a lot of the visual gags out there. He wants gore might be too strong of a word, but the horror aspects of the
Yeah,
film,
yeah.
if you can call them.
Well, yeah, that was the interesting thing because I had heard about this movie and people talking about how they're like, being, you know, severed and stuff like that, and eviscerated and all this kind of stuff. And then you watch it and other than like really the clock scene, there's not really a whole lot of blood. And it's like when the in the scene when you know guys, this if you have not seen this movie before, I'm going to tell you, pause this episode and then go watch the movie and then come back, because we are going to be talking about a lot of stuff that happens in this, and it will really serve you better if you experience this stuff first and then listen to this episode.
Completely agree.
But like in the scene when Melody gets devoured by the piano, there's like this, it's red, there are these flashes of red as she's getting devoured by the piano, but it's not blood. It's just red coloring on the film itself.
Right, right. Yeah. It's in no way meant to be a realistic blood at all. It's
Mhm.
animated, right? It's animated blood a lot of the times, except for the
Yeah.
clock. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, and I thought that well, also, and when the the blood's coming out of the faucet, but even then it doesn't look like blood. It's just like water with red food
Yeah, like
coloring.
Kool-Aid or something, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
exactly. Yeah. Um, but when you mentioned about how like the way that the transitions are set up, and that was interesting too. Like when what's her name, Yoko, the stepmother comes in, and there's the scene of the scarf dropping, right, there's
yeah,
like this freeze frame. And the way I described it in my notes was it's almost like watching a comic book, right? Like these very these freeze frames, these jumpy transitions. It felt very much like you're reading a comic book, almost like I know a lot of people don't like this movie, but Ang Lee's Hulk film had something, not quite the same, but it was trying to do that thing where it's trying to replicate the feel of a comic book, which I think this one did a little bit better in terms of like having those different freeze frames that come in and then it switches to something else. It was a very jarring if you're at first, so I imagine that was probably why it got a lot of negative reviews. but um, but I thought that was
yeah,
that was an interesting way to showcase it.
yeah. And that scarf scene, as you're pointing out, it's almost like two panels, like a comic. You're
Hmm.
one side is the moving scarf falling, the other is the freeze frame of Gorgeous. And he does stuff like that throughout the whole movie. In the closing credits is another great example. As the credits are
Hmm.
rolling, he's doing like this. It's not stop motion, but I don't know a better word to describe the film that moves a little bit and stops. I
Right.
actually watched his first film from 1966. It wasn't a
Oh,
feature.
okay. So this wasn't his. Okay. Oh, that's right. The short film he had done, right?
Yep, called Emotion. And that one's even more jerky. Um, I don't know if that's a negative word to use, but it's even the whole
Mm.
thing is that stop, flow. But it's kind of fun because you can see some of the DNA of House in Emotion.
Hmm.
And then, have you ever seen the silent film from the USA called Sunrise?
I don't think so.
In Sunrise, they do a little bit of it almost feels like a montage, but they'll put different film next to each other, similar to that the scarf scene that you mentioned. But in Sunrise,
Hmm.
it's used to show the modern excited city. So they'll show like the blinking lights of the boardwalk, at the same time trains moving in and out, maybe a radio tower. Like it's used more to create excitement while a jumpy song is playing, not
Okay.
to give us what Gorgeous is feeling right now that her dad found someone new to start dating.
And, I was trying to wonder what kind of I was thinking about the story itself and about the names because the characters they're all named after like each of their names gives you some clue about what kind of character. So it's like I said, very surface level characterization. Like the main character is gorgeous or oshade in Japanese, which also means like kind of like fashionable or stylish, and um she's because she's a beautiful young woman. And then you've got kung fu because she knows martial arts. You have prof or gari in Japanese because she's like the intellectual one, complete with wearing glasses. Fanta or fantasy because she's always daydreaming. Um, you've got Mac, who is the quote unquote fat girl, even though she's pretty damn skinny. So I thought that was weird when they're
Yeah.
all talking about how fat she is. I'm like, my God, no. Then you have Sweet, who is like kind of like the very like kind of outgoing, very kind girl. Melody, who's very interested in music. Um, so they're all these so very surface level names. They all tell you exactly what you need to know about each of their characters, which I thought was funny. But also, I was kind of thinking like it's got some fairy tale elements to the basic story, right? You've got the father coming in. He's got this new wife, the quote unquote evil stepmother. You've got Gorgeous, most beautiful girl in all the world. She ends up going away. So there's like elements of like Snow White in there, especially because I noticed she is wearing a lot of white in a lot of scenes too. Um, there's elements of Sleeping Beauty in that, and even with like the whole gang of girls, that's very similar to like almost the Seven Dwarves in a lot of ways. So I thought there was
Absolutely.
some
And
interesting like
the ant being the witch as well.
yes, exactly, yeah,
Hmm
exactly, yeah.
hmm
Well, also you had, a bit of the the standard ending where it's like, the knight in shining armor comes riding in to save them all, which they end up
Togo-san.
inverting. Yeah, which they end up completely inverting anyway. But so I thought it was interesting that he's drawing. It seems, at least from, just my first viewing of this, that he is drawing a lot from these different elements of fairy tales for the basics of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of my favorite things to do in fantasy films, fantasy stories, is to look for the boundaries between the mundane world and the fantasy
Hmm.
world. And this movie has some absolutely great, great boundaries. Um,
Hmm.
and so the first boundary that we kind of see, I think, is the train station. So they're getting on the train, and it's the first time they're going to leave the mundane world, and they're heading towards the fantasy world. And
Hmm.
then they get off the bus, and there's a great scene where there's a painting of the landscape and the sky, and then the camera zooms out, and they're in the middle of a field with a gorgeous landscape and sky. So again, you kind of have this weird boundary thing going on there. And then I think the final boundary is when the camera breaks. It's one of the
Hmm.
first magical things the girls are affected by. And it's kind of the fantasy world saying, no, 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 you cannot take modern technology, right? In the 70s,
Hmm.
a camera would probably be a good representation of
Right.
modern technology. You cannot take mundane items from the mundane world into this fantasy world. And from
Hmm.
there on in, they are in an absolute fantasy world where anything can happen, which I
Yeah.
really enjoy them crossing that
Well,
boundary.
also too, when in the train scene too, it's that weird animation stuff that's happening too as the transition. So I thought that too, and even like when they're inside the train, like, I mean, I assume when you were living in Japan, you guys rode the Shinkansen yourself, but I
Yeah.
mean, looking at that train, I'm just like, this is not at all what my experience on a Shinkansen is. Nobody is like this boisterous and all this and like running
Hmm.
around and all that. And I'm just like, if anyone was talking like that on an actual Shinkansen, they'd be, the conductor would be coming around to yell at them.
Absolutely. And then I don't know if you noticed the joke of the people on the train. It was like a Mel Brooks movie. It was a nun.
It
There was just a
was, yes, I
it was
did, yeah.
a bunch of stereotypes on the train. Um, the other thing they used the train and the bus ride for is to explain the story of the ant,
Hmm.
which is pretty
Yeah.
devastating. Um, First of all, it was really cool that it was shot like a silent film. I kind of paid homage. There's an Ozu film I watched, I Was Born, which is an old silent film that was pretty good. And then it also reminded me of another. I don't know if this was a silent film, but it reminded me of Mr. Thank You. I don't know if you ever heard of the film Mr.
I've never
Thank
heard of
You,
that
but
one.
it's a guy that drives a bus and he says thank you when people get out of his way. It's pretty funny. It's worth a watch. It's shot like a silent film, and it's shot as if the girls are watching it and they're commenting
Hmm.
it. And again, I'd never really seen something like that in a movie before. So I did enjoy that. Which brings us to the end of that silent film, which was The Bomb.
Hmm.
Have you seen any of the interviews with the director at all with Obayashi?
No, no, no. This is like the first time I've ever looked into this director at all.
So I've not spent too much time with these interviews, but one of the things he says is the cat specifically represents the bomb and how he lost people to the bomb, and that's what's happening.
Oh, okay.
So it's very much so affected by, Japan's history there.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm looking at his bio now. So he was born in 1938, and his father was a doctor and was called to the front in the war. Um, and it was his maternal grandparents who basically raised him. Um, and in the 19, I mean, his father survived the war, because it says in the 50s his father urged him to enter medical school, but he decided instead to go into the arts. It doesn't say much about him, other than that, though, as far as his early life, at least here in the Wikipedia article. So I'd be very curious to take a look at that um interview you'd mentioned. Uh but also he's done I was looking too at his filmography, because, like I said, I'd never heard of him before this, and I'm surprised, like, he did a lot of stuff, including he did the looks like it was the live action version of the girl who leapt through time. We covered
Oh,
the animated version on here a while back, but and we had talked a little bit about the live action one because I think the guest on the time had seen it. Guys, I'm sorry if I'm misremembering anything. It's that was like 3 years ago when we covered that movie. Um, but he also did this other movie. His last movie was called Labyrinth of Cinema, and it's called an anti-war fantasy drama film that he wrote, produced, and directed. And it's about a bunch of Onomichi moviegoers who get transported back to 1945 just before the the atomic bomb was
mm,
dropped.
right.
So have you seen this movie?
No, I've not. Nope.
I am
I
very
start.
curious to look this up now.
Yeah, I would absolutely watch more films by Obayashi. This morning I started watching Sada. Have you heard of Sada?
I was just noticing that name on here, so I haven't seen it yet. No, I haven't heard of it before.
It does feel like he progressed a lot as a filmmaker. It was still as zany, and there was
Hmm.
still some silly stuff in it, but it definitely felt like a more put together film than House.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. Labyrinth of Cinema seems really interesting, but this it doesn't say anything. It just says it's based on the true story of Sada Abe. Oh, I have heard about this story though. Um, yes, I have heard about this story. She was a geisha and a prostitute. She had murdered her lover in 1936, castrating him, and she carried his penis and testicles around with her in her kimono. Um, and I think this has actually been made into a few different movies, from what I understand.
Wow. Hmm. I didn't get that far in the movie.
Yeah. So there are a few different ones. There was a woman called Sada Abe, um, in the realm of the senses. Like you said, Sada, and then Heiseiban Abe Sada, Antaga Hoshi, and then Pure, starring Asa Akira, who's a porn star. So I'm interested in what that one would have been like. And then Abe Sada Saigo no Nano Kakan. So yeah,
That's
there have been a bunch of different stuff. Lots of literature about her too, as well, like a bunch of plays and stuff like that too. Even she even called like a panic in Japan too.
mm, yeah, I guess if nothing else, inspirational.
Yeah. So yeah, I had heard about that film before, so I am interested in checking that out as well. So you've only just started to see it. You haven't seen it all the way through then?
No, I got about 20 minutes in.
Okay, all right. So yeah, I'm curious to see that. But going back to House, one of the interesting things too, like, is the just like how they like we kind of like all these like kind of little visual effects because it was an interesting choice because it's not like they didn't have the technology to do more realistic effects back in the 1970s. Like if you look at some stuff, even like, you go back to Kaidan, which came out I think in the 1960s and which we covered last season. That one, had really good special effects for what they were trying to do. And they had lots of like low-key special effects that they could have done easily, but he made a conscious effort to have these kind of like almost cartoonish special effects that I thought was an interesting choice.
Yeah, in the interviews, I believe he said that he didn't prep a lot of the special effects. He wanted to do them in
Mhm.
real time on set and figure it out as he went, which I think that's probably one of the reasons this movie survives in the zeitgeist so long
Mhm.
is the special effects and how corny and hammy and fun they are.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's because it's definitely stands out in your mind when you're watching like these little squiggly lines for like impacts and all that, or um
The
uh,
dancing skeleton, like
the
it's
dancing skeleton, which
mhm.
starts off animated, or when the watermelon vendor transforms into a skeleton and it's a
Right.
cartoon at first.
Or even the fingers that play the piano, just the
Yeah.
fingers. That was actually
Mhm.
kind of a cool scene. Um,
That was actually a very effective special effect, I thought. Like I thought the when it chopped off her hand, it looked a little, and when it was devouring her in the piano, it looked a little bit cheesy, but the fingers themselves was really effective, I thought.
yeah, no, that looked good. You know, in my head, I'm convinced he started with this piano scene in his mind. He said, "What if
Hmm.
a piano ate somebody?" and then built the rest of the movie around that. I don't think that's what happened, but watching the film, that's what it feels like. That's the anchoring scene in my head. Everything else, how do I get to this scene, and then what happens after is how I imagine he
Mhm.
put this film together.
That's probably what happened. I mean, I could definitely see that because that does seem like the scene where he put the most care into the visual effect.
Yeah. And that I don't know if it's a motif, but that song that plays throughout the whole movie over and
Hmm.
over and over again, it is the piano.
Yeah, yeah. What are some other things that kind of jumped out to you on this latest viewing?
So I was thinking about the order of the deaths for the girls,
Hmm.
and I was trying to read way too much into it because I was wondering if the order they died in, does that represent something? So
Hmm.
Max the first that dies, does that show food's not available? Is this like a post-war, there's no food, that was the first thing to go? Then Sweet dies.
Hmm.
So is that like niceness? Like people started getting kind of mean? Then
Hmm.
Melody
Hmm.
dies. So did we lose the music? Did we lose the arts at that point? Then Kung Fu. So did we lose our fighting spirit? Then Prof. Did we lose our intelligence? Do we lose the ability to make good decisions? And
Hmm.
then fantasy dies. So anything that you believed might have happened before, you've now lost hope. It's
Right,
gone.
like the end of hope and all that. Yeah,
Yep.
that's an interesting idea. I did not think too much about the order that they died in. But that's a really interesting. I think there's something to that. Because this is very obviously heavily influenced by the war with everything that happened to her aunt during the war. So again, to kind of recap for people, there was her aunt was married to I think he was a doctor, wasn't he? If I'm not mistaken, or am I misremembering?
No,
Or
he
he
might
was
have been. Yeah. I'm trying
okay.
to
I think
remember.
so.
Yep.
Yeah. So obviously he's and since Obayashi's father was a doctor who got called to the front, obviously there's some he's obviously pulling from his own background in that. But he got called to the war and she was waiting for him to return and he never did. He died in the war and but she just um so she just basically lived by herself more or less after that. And what we find out later is that her spirit was so her spirit just kind of went away and then her body remained here and just started consuming any unmarried girls who come to the house. So I think there's also something there about especially I thought it was interesting too because the teacher at the beginning, the female teacher, they make mention about the fact that she's getting married soon and that it's an
Mm.
arranged marriage.
Hmm.
Um, and so I'm just pulling stuff out here. Again, this is my first time watching this movie, so I'm just kind of like, playing a little bit of jazz with this. I'm thinking these things through. But I do wonder if there is some sort of because these girls, they're pretty they've got pretty strong personalities, right? So they don't
Yes.
and I mean, like even like the fact that, Gorgeous is talking back to her father and like this and like denying her father and like she seems like the one who's more in control in that relationship with him. I mean she doesn't even ask his permission if she can go to her aunt's house. She just writes her aunt's a letter and then she's like I'm going.
I'm out of here. Yeah. No, all the girls have their own agency, right? That's absolutely.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And then they get devoured by this aunt who was waiting for this marriage that never came and she's always consuming unmarried girls
Yep.
specifically. So it does make me wonder if this is some kind of commentary on Japanese patriarchy as well.
Mm, could be. In my head, sure, it was the ant that was kind of devouring, but I wonder if whatever that devours did that to the ant. So the spirit or
Mhm.
the entity lived before the ant did, kind of became the ant and is now gorgeous. So
Yeah, that's something too. Because it's obviously we've got that thing from the diary saying that the ant's it's basically just her body there, but she's not there
right.
anymore.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then we see that happens to Gorgeous at the end. Uh, because it says so in the end, Gorgeous appears as her aunt in the reflection in the mirror, in the blood, but it does seem like it is Gorgeous at the end. And then she consumes, she burns away Ryoko into nothing. And and Ryoko as well. She seems like a pretty progressive woman for that time, right? She's this jewelry designer. I thought it was interesting too. Also, she is one of the few female characters. She wears pants the whole time in every scene she's in.
Oh, I didn't notice. Huh. So let's talk about Ryoko a little bit. So the Gorgeous's dad met her in Italy, but
I
she's
don't know if he actually met her in Italy. Like he had
okay.
gone to Italy because she is in that first scene, actually, I was trying to look at her and trying to focus on her face because it was a little bit hard to see at first if she was Japanese or if she was maybe Italian. So
Right.
and then once she starts speaking, once they show her name, like, okay, yeah, she is Japanese. So yeah, that was my first thought was like maybe he had met this woman in Italy and then he had brought her back. But when she said her name and they talked about her, I'm like, okay, so she is Japanese. So that made, and he said like, I wanted to talk to you about this before. So it makes me think that maybe they'd been together for a
Oh,
while and then
got
maybe he
it.
had taken her to Italy with him or something like that.
That makes sense because she's the last death.
Hmm.
Unless you count Togo-san, I don't know where his where his demise fits in this.
Well, we
So
do see that pile of bananas before, so I'm pretty sure that he died before that, unless the bananas are
okay.
sentient, which
Oh,
in this
that's right,
movie would
right.
not surprise me.
Yep. She sees the bananas. That's right. Banana, banana, banana. That's another hilarious line. The watermelon guy. I He fits well in this movie, but
Hmm.
very bizarre got another bizarre character they stumble across. So maybe that fantasy boundary actually starts right when they get off the bus, right? Maybe
I think it might, yeah.
yeah, the watermelon guy, he must be part of the fantasy world as opposed to
Hmm.
the mundane now that I'm thinking about it. Hmm.
So was there anything else you wanted to add about Ryoko?
No, well, I was just trying to see how she fit into the idea of the deaths, right? So we
Hmm.
went through all the girls, and then if Ryoko's the last death, does that fit in with this crazy idea of reading too much into these deaths? But I couldn't place her in the movie, or I couldn't place her character, so I couldn't assign anything to her death.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm wondering too, because she's also because all the other girls die in some form of being consumed, right? But Ryoko doesn't. She's burned away into nothing. So, I mean, one thing it might be because there is we see how, what kind of a strong person Gorgeous is from early on in the movie. Um, but slowly as the movie progresses, she kind of starts to lose that agency, right? She almost becomes like almost like a non-entity for a big part of the movie, and then it's the other girls kind of take center stage. Um, and we get like a scenes here and there with her in the background, but she is not driving the story, which is why what made me think of Sleeping Beauty. Um, but
Yeah,
early on, right? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
once she's consumed by the cat, or once she's consumed by the house,
Mhm.
she is now almost a zombie or a ghost, just kind of marching through. Yeah, completely different person.
Yeah. Yeah, and also like when we go back to her in the beginning, like when she's talking to her father, right? Obviously, she's, like I said before, she's very beautiful. Her name is gorgeous, obviously, very stylish. Like even when they're on the train and all that, she's dressed like an adult, right? She's dressed like a sophisticated, stylish woman. She's not dressed like a teenager. And Ryoko's very much the same way. So I do wonder if maybe this is kind of like, but at the end of the movie, she's dressed in the kimono, right? Very classic style. She's much more in the classic Japanese style. And then she burns away Ryoko. So I wonder if this is maybe it's like a metaphor of her kind of like burning away she could have been if she hadn't been consumed by this
Mm,
house.
that could be shedding the past, shedding the other path that would have
Yeah,
been.
yeah. Especially I did think it was, and going back to the fairy tale comparison, like when we have Togo coming in and the Fanta's little fantasy of like him, riding in to save her and all that kind of
Oh
stuff.
yeah, that's another
And
one.
and then he just, like you said, that scene where he's just such a buffoon. He ends up, getting distracted at a ramen stand and he ends up getting transformed into a pile of bananas. Um, so my thought when she had that fantasy, I started putting together the fairy tale comparisons. I'm like, oh, maybe it's going to be the quote unquote evil stepmother who comes in to save the day. But then she doesn't do that. She
Oh,
doesn't save the day either.
mm-hmm. That would have been an interesting inverse. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, the other boundary crossing is right before Togo goes on his bucket ride. Early on in the movie,
Mhm.
he falls into that bucket and kind of slides around the street a little bit. The cat, he almost steps on the cat. So that's
Ah,
another boundary breaking situation.
and trying to think of some other things well, I'm trying to think of other things here to kind of focus in on, but there's just so much that happens in this movie that it's difficult to kind of think of like one thing to focus in on here. How about you? Any other things that kind of jumped out at you with this that you wanted to talk about?
One of the other things I liked about the music was Kung Fu's motif. Whenever she
Hmm.
started fighting, I don't remember exactly how it goes, dun-dun-dun-dun-dun, dun-dun-dun, something like that, where I really enjoyed the corny music that would play when she started fighting the chandelier or fighting what was it over by the well that started to attack her? That might have been, was that Gorgeous? Did she actually fight Gorgeous at that scene? I'm trying to remember.
I can't remember. Like, there's so much going on in this movie. It's um I'm trying to look up here, see if it says. But yeah, the light fixture. There was a painting of Blanche. She kills the painting of Blanche's on the wall too. Um, but yeah, I'm not sure. But yeah, Kung Fu was interesting too, in the fact that she also ends up, wearing like these weird cutoff shorts throughout the movie.
Yeah. hmm That was a that was strange. Her outfit change was pretty strange.
Hmm. Um, and you're right. He had talked about the atomic bombings in it, and he had lost all his childhood friends in the bombs, and so he'd applied these elements into the idea of a ghost waiting for her lovers to return, and that turned her into an evil spirit. And he also chose the title because he felt that having a foreign title instead of like the Japanese word would be make it more taboo and seem a little bit
Ah, interesting.
stranger in it.
Yeah, if I could time travel, if I could literally, get into a DeLorean or whatever, one of the places I
Mhm.
would go would be opening night for House in Japan. I think it would be really cool to see
It'd
the
be interesting,
audience's
yeah.
first reaction. That would be a
Well, also, this
fun.
is interesting is that he had gotten a lot of input about this on the story from his daughter. She was a preteen at the time, and his whole idea was he said that adults only think about things they understand. Everything stays on that boring human level, whereas children can come up with things that can't be explained. And so things like, a reflection in a mirror attacking the viewer, a watermelon being pulled out of a well looking like a human head, and a house that eats girls. All of that was kind of suggested by his daughter.
Wow.
Um, she also drew on her own childhood fears. So that included like a pile of futons falling on her. It felt like a monster attacking her. A large loud clock at her grandparents' home and getting her fingers caught between the piano keys. And and then that reminded Chiho Katsura, who worked on the script with him, about a short story about an old woman who's visited by her granddaughters, and then she puts them in a trunk.
Hmm. Yeah, I could absolutely see this being co-written by an 11-year-old or an 8-year-old. That
Mm.
makes a lot of sense. Hey Perry, how about the fish? The fish that they kept
Oh,
cutting
that
to?
was yeah, that was interesting. Yeah, that was weird too, especially because the aunt is like she like eats the fish and then she puts it back in. So
It comes back to life. I didn't know if at one point
yeah.
that's who the girls were now. They were the fish. I couldn't quite connect those dots either. Because Fantasy has them at one point. After the piano scene, they fall out of the
Hmm.
bowl, the fish, and Fantasy has them. And I don't remember if it's Prof or Sweet. They're like, Fantasy, why do you have these fish? And she's like, oh, I don't know.
um, and it's fun too. Like it something else too about this is I'm looking at some of the filming behind the scenes that um the producer told him that Toho was tired of losing money on comprehensible films. And they thought that, and so one of the reasons they let this movie, they greenlit this movie, is because it was incomprehensible.
Wow.
And apparently, like he wasn't a member of the Toho staff, so he wasn't originally picked to direct, but they couldn't find anyone who wanted to direct this. So finally, they just gave it to him. Um, he didn't have any sort of storyboards on set, and it was a very upbeat atmosphere on set because he often skipped around. He would play quiz games with the younger actresses. But members of the Toho crew, they all felt like this film was absolute nonsense.
Yeah,
And he said that he had played the soundtrack on set because that changed the way that the girls were acting in the film, and they kind of got into the music. Um, so trying to see what other thing is on here. But yeah, he also found that the acting of the girls was definitely not up to snuff, which explains a lot of my feelings to it, especially in the beginning there.
yeah, they were pretty silly. But again, I think with their acting, the special effects, the soundtrack, I think that's why it all works. I think.
It does. It all kind of fits together in a bizarre way.
Hmm.
But yeah, I'm trying to think about other things that I wanted to touch on here. It's hard to talk about specific things that we haven't already talked about so far, just because this really is a movie that you just have to just sit down and watch yourself. Like just talking about it alone won't do it justice. So if you have not seen this movie, and if you didn't listen to me, like I told you to at the beginning of this discussion, you really need to go out and watch this movie.
The other thing that helps the movie, it's got a pretty short runtime. I think it's about 90
Yeah,
minutes.
yeah.
If it was much longer, it might have been a little too exhausting to stick with.
I think so too. And so like I said, like that beginning portion is really kind of like the slowest part of the movie where they're kind of like in the real world. And I think Obayashi kind of felt the same way. I think he just kind of felt like, all right, this is stuff we got to get out of the way. We got to get this exposition stuff out of the way. And then once they get on the train, then it just kind of goes into weird territory from then on.
Yeah. And then once Gorgeous transforms and comes down, then it's
Mhm.
going at a breakneck pace, just
Yeah.
nonstop. Um, I mean, the scene where the house is like falling apart or filling with, I don't know, water, blood, whatever you want to call it, and they're like
Mhm.
riding the tatamis. That was also a pretty cool,
Mhm.
terrifying situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Um, and it looks like this whole film it was one of Toho's largest sets, and he and apparently it took 2 months to film this, which is, I think it's a little bit long, if I understand correctly. um and yeah, I'm looking up about the release because I like Toho. They did not expect this film to be successful at all, but it was actually a commercial hit at the time, and it was very popular with young people.
Yeah, I can
Um,
believe it.
but
If you can buy into it,
mhm.
it's great.
But the most of the reviewers in Japan didn't even talk about it at all, and the few that did review it was very negative. Um, and it wasn't until it started being shown in North America when it started to receive some positive reviews.
And that
And
was pretty late, right? That wasn't in the 70s. That does the article say? I'm pretty sure it wasn't until
I'm
like
checking.
96, 97 it was brought over.
It says, I mean, this article, like, it just says that it doesn't say when it was first
Oh, okay, maybe I have that wrong.
released here. Yeah. Um yeah, it said that two sold out shows, the 2009 New York Asian Film Festival. And
Oh,
then
wow, even
in
later.
2010, a remastered print by Janus was being shown theatrically across North America. So yeah, that was after I'd already come to Japan actually. And then later it ended up getting released on Criterion Collection in 2010.
Yeah, and actually, audience, if you're in the States, so hopefully you've already seen it, but it's on HBO right now at the time of the recording, and it's on the Criterion streaming, Criterion channel.
Mhm.
And that's where a lot of the interviews are too.
Okay, yeah, yeah. Um, but yeah, what it and since it got released here, it definitely has gotten a lot more positive reception. It's it's become like a cult classic now, and Rotten Tomatoes has like a 90% approval on it.
Wow, that's pretty
Mhm.
surprising.
Okay. Is there anything else we wanted to touch on here that we haven't talked about so far?
I think that's all I had. That's my exploration of House.
Yeah, I'm just looking through my notes real quick. Yeah, I think we had talked about all this stuff already here. You know, the I wrote the terrible dialogue. Also, the splashes of red in the black and white scene where it just looked really overly cheesy to the point where it didn't have to
Yeah.
be. So like the kind of weird effects they're doing, which like you said, it does work in a weird way because you do feel this kind of complete disconnection from the movie when you see these really odd uses of effects. So it does help with that whole kind of idea of we are not in the real world here at all.
Yeah. And maybe to your point about it being a comic book, some of that also
Hmm.
feels kind of comic booky too, those special effects. So not only the style of the blocking and the transitions and the weird half the frame is moving, half the frame isn't, and the special effects, I think would
Hmm.
fit right into a comic book. So if you could just
Well, I think
change your
there was
mindset.
actually there was a companion manga to this, I think, or something along
Oh,
those lines. I glanced at saw something about that in the Wikipedia. But I'm also looking at but also some of these movie posters for it too, right? Like the posters of it are not what you'd think of for this kind of for a movie like this. Like the movie posters are really kind of cartoonish.
yeah, a lot of them are hand drawn, right? It's like that house with a tongue.
Hmm. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I'm just looking them up right now to just double check on some of them because I saw this. I picked this up in a Japanese video store. When I saw the DVD cover, I'm like, "Oh, this isn't the same one, is it?" Um, and then I just double checked. I'm like, "No, this is the same one, 1977." And I'm just bringing them up here on the movie database. And here we go. And yeah, they're like you've got the drawing of the cat, you've got the drawing of the house with like its tongue sticking out. You've got another one that looks almost like a child drawing with like all the different characters in it. So these are just some you don't have a lot of like if you didn't know this was a horror movie going into it, I think you could have picked this up thinking it was like a kids movie.
Yeah. Yeah, they look like the horror kids book
Hmm.
drawings.
Yeah, yeah. So and I think that's obviously influenced by the fact that his daughter had some input on how it was written too. But yeah, it's just you know what I used to say that. Have you seen Gozu, directed by
No, I
Miike?
haven't. Mm-mm.
So Gozu,
Nope.
it's a great film. It's really freaking bizarre, and I used to say that that was probably the most bizarre Japanese movie I'd ever seen. I think House may give it a run for its money.
Wow. I'll have to check out Gozu. Yeah, House is a pretty bizarre movie.
Hmm. And I definitely have to check out Labyrinth of Cinema and Sada now. I'm very interested in checking these out as well. Um, Also, the his version of the girl who leapt through time, like I've seen the anime and now and I knew that there was a live action version, but didn't really care too much about it because the anime was okay. It just didn't wasn't something that was like I got crazy over. But after knowing now that he directed it, I'm more curious to check it out.
Yeah, I'm hoping to finish Sada and watch some of his other films.
Mhm. Okay, KJ. So thanks so much for coming on. It's a fun discussion. So why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me, Perry. This is great. I love the show. So we have a few shows. We're on YouTube as Talking Studios. We are in podcast land. I don't know what you call it. Apple Podcasts. I don't know if Google Podcasts is around anymore, but
I think
Spotify.
it's still around at the time of recording this, but it is going away soon, from what I
It's
understand.
almost out of here. Okay, so
Yeah.
on Apple Podcasts and those things, we have Talking Pictures Trivia, Limited Lexicon, where we play through text-based adventure games. Um, it's really fun. Go check that out. We have another show called Get the Point, where we take the movie posters from Talking Pictures Trivia, we pointalize them to various degrees, and the co-hosts try to guess which ones it is. So if you're on YouTube, you can see those and play along. And then shortly, March in 2024, not sure exactly when you're listening to this audience, but March 2024, we should have a show coming out called Adapt It, where we're going to be looking at adaptations like Lord of the Rings, Pride and Prejudice, The Trial, the Super Mario Brothers movies, stuff like this. And then this summer, we're going to have Keep Making Movies, which is an exploration of micro-budget films. Like I'd mentioned, we're going to do a few Japanese films. We're going to do stuff like Cube. You ever hear of Cube, Perry? You ever hear this?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
So yeah, movies like Cube, Circle.
In fact, there was even a Japanese remake of it, I believe.
I saw the poster. I absolutely want to jump into that too. I can't imagine what that is like. But yeah, audience, that's where you can find me. We're on Blue Sky. We're on whatever they call Twitter these days as Talking Studios.
Okay, great. So by the time audience you're listening to this, it will be summer by the time these episodes start coming out. So all that stuff should be available. So you'll be able to go check that out. We'll have links to that stuff in the show notes. So just check those out as well. KJ, again, thanks so much for coming on. And that does it for this episode of Japan on Film. JapanOnFilm.com is the website, and we are Japan on Film on the socials, which is these days pretty much just Instagram, Blue Sky, and Threads. We've, kind of locked down the Twitter account. We're not using it anymore. So, but it's just going to stay there so no scammers come in and try and take the name or anything like that. We're also part of the Film Stories Network, so please check us out at filmstories.co.uk and listen up after the credits to hear what's coming up next on the network. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the Film Stories Podcast Network. Visit JapanOnFilm.com for show notes, episodes, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. The show is at Japan on Film on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, so please be sure to follow us. If you'd like to support the show, you can donate on JapanOnFilm.com, purchase from our advertisers, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Join the Film Stories Podcast Network Discord from the link in the show notes to connect with me and many other cinema fans and podcasters.
Britain. Fish and chips, cups of tea, the smell of the theatrical grease paint, the roar of the football crowd. A diverse nation grappling with its own long, complex history, always with one tongue firmly in cheek. Over the last century, British film has ebbed and flowed from Ealing comedy to carry-on sauciness, from the British New Wave to Cool Britannia, from Hammer Horror to Hammer Horror again. Forget Hollywood, embrace Pinewood. I'm AJ Black, author, writer and podcaster, and I love British film. Join me in a celebration of its quirks, its successes, its failures, and its unique gems at the Pictures in Britain. Please find and subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your podcast player of choice. Find the podcast on Linktree, linktr.ee/at the Pictures in Britain. And check out the Film Stories Podcast Network at www.filmstories.co.uk. See you at the Pictures.